Hello and welcome back. They're a crown, not a person yet, not a story yet, just the object. Let it sit for a moment before everything else arrives. It is a Cainhurst crown. Made by the people who lived in the castle on the hill, produced by the specific aesthetic tradition of a noble house that had been refining its sense of beauty for long enough that the refining had become its own kind of art. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The object is extraordinary. If you picked it up without knowing anything about it, without knowing where it came from or what it did or whose head it has most recently been on, you would understand immediately that it was made by people who took the making of things seriously, who believed that an object worn by a sovereign should carry the full weight of what sovereignty meant to the people who recognized it. It creates illusions. This is its specific property, the thing that makes it more than a beautiful object, the thing that makes it dangerous in the particular way that objects which change what people can perceive are always dangerous. It conceals. It maintains a version of reality that is not the full version, keeps certain things hidden from the eyes of anyone who does not have the crown and know how to use it. The passage behind the illusion leads somewhere. The somewhere is important. What lives in the somewhere is the reason the crown matters. Now, the person. The crown is on the head of a man named Logarius. It has been there for centuries. He put it there himself in the aftermath of a battle he led against the people who made it, and he's not taken it off since. He's on the roof of the castle that the battle emptied. He is in the wind and the frost of a sky that stopped being an ordinary sky a very long time ago. He's alone in the specific way that a person is alone when everyone who knew them before the thing that changed everything is gone. He did not put the crown on because he wanted to wear it. He put it on because the situation required someone to wear it, and he was the only one left who understood what the situation required. That sentence is the whole story. Everything else is the explanation of it. Settle in. Let your body go heavy. Let me tell you everything about the crown, and the man who wore it, and the order that sent him to the castle and the castle that gave him the crown, and the centuries between the putting on and the taking off. This is the complete lore of Martyr Logarius. Walk through Cainhurst before the executioners arrive, not as a hunter, not with a weapon in your hand and the night's logic pushing you forward. Just walk through it as it was, as a place where people lived. The chandeliers are lit. They are always lit in Cainhurst, in the game's frozen present as in the living past, because the castle was built by people who understood that light is not simply a practical matter, that the quality of the light in a room changes what the room means, that a chandelier is not simply a mechanism for visibility, but a statement about the seriousness with which the people who installed it take the experience of being in the room below it. The chandeliers in Cainhurst are extraordinary. They have always been extraordinary. They were extraordinary when the castle was full, and they are extraordinary now that the castle is empty and the frost has settled over everything, and there is no one left to appreciate them except the things that wander through the frozen halls and whatever you are when you arrive by phantom carriage from a road that should not exist. The banquet tables are set. They have always been set in Cainhurst, even now, even after everything. This is one of the details the game gives you that does not require explanation to land. You walk into a room with a table set for a dinner that no one is coming to, and you understand immediately and completely what that means. Someone expected to come back. Someone prepared for a future that did not arrive. The stopped moment in Cainhurst is the moment just before the ending, and it is preserved with a fidelity that the word frozen does not quite capture, because frozen implies cold, and what Cainhurst has is not simply cold, but stopped, halted, held at the exact point before the last thing happened. The people who lived here were the Vilebloods, practitioners of an inheritance that ran in the blood of the Cainhurst noble line, and that the healing church had classified as a corruption of the old blood. What the classification meant, what the church's specific objection to Vileblood was, and whether the objection was just, is something we will spend a great deal of time on. But before the classification, and before the objection, and before the executioners, who were the institutional response to the objection, there were just the people, in the lit rooms and the set tables and the castle that they had built and lived in and refined over the generations of the noble house. They were fast. The Vileblood inheritance gave them speed and a specific kind of perceptual acuity and a relationship with the ordinary span of a human life that did not map cleanly onto what the church considered a human life to be. They had needs that the inheritance imposed on them, needs that the church's account of them emphasizes, and that their own account of themselves would have placed in a different context. The blood required sustenance beyond what ordinary blood ministration provided. This is the thing that made them, from the church's perspective, most clearly a problem, and it is the thing that, from their own perspective, was simply a fact of what they were, the specific demand that the inheritance placed on the people who carried it. Maria came from here, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, whose story belongs to another video but whose presence here matters, because she is the most complete evidence of what Cainhurst produced in its people. She was of this noble line, she carried this inheritance, and she was not a monster. She was a person of extraordinary moral seriousness, who spent her life thinking carefully about what she owed the people around her, and who could not continue hunting after the fishing. Hamlet showed her what hunting could require. That person came from Cainhurst. That specific quality of moral seriousness, that willingness to stop when the thing the hunter asked for exceeded what she could give and remain herself, that was produced by a lineage the church called corrupt. This does not mean the church was wrong about everything. The danger of the Vileblood inheritance was real. The specific properties of the blood and what those properties could produce in people who carried them, and the threat that the carrying posed to the church's project of managing the old blood and its effects, these were genuine concerns rather than institutional pretexts. The church was not simply fabricating a problem to justify a solution it wanted to apply. But the people were more than the danger. They always are. The specific people in the specific rooms with the specific chandeliers and the specific tables set for dinners they did not know they would never get to eat were more than the category the church had placed them in. And what happened to those people, and what it required of the man who was sent to make it happen, is the story. Now bring in the executioners, but notice before you bring them in what the castle is asking you to hold simultaneously. The beauty and the danger, the people and the category, the specific individuals in the specific rooms, and the general threat that the specific individuals collectively represented. The chandelier-lit world of a noble house that had refined its sense of itself over generations, and the direction that the blood was moving the people who lived in that world in ways that the church identified as dangerous, and that the evidence the church's scholarship was based on supported identifying as dangerous. Bloodborne does not resolve this. It is one of the game's specific and deliberate choices to leave the question open, to give you both the evidence for the church's account and the evidence against it, and to not arbitrate between them. You can look at Cainhurst and see a threat that required addressing. You can look at it and see a world that was destroyed. Both of these are available. Both of these are supported by the evidence. The game trusts you to hold the both of them without requiring a verdict. Logarius held both of them too. His whole life. The conviction that the threat was real, and the full reckoning with what addressing the threat had cost. He did not get the game's option of walking away without a verdict. He had to act, and the acting required the verdict, and the verdict required the conviction, and the conviction required him to choose which reading he would act on, even knowing that the other reading was also supported. He chose the threat. He acted on the threat. He held the cost of the acting for centuries. Now bring in the executioners. But first, one more thing about the castle. One detail that the account of the assault and its justifications tend to leave out, because the detail does not fit cleanly into the institutional narrative, and because the institutional narrative, like all institutional narratives, tends toward the clean. Cainhurst produced Maria, Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. You may know her story. If you do not, the short version is this. She was of the Cainhurst noble line. She carried the Vileblood inheritance. She left Cainhurst before the executioners arrived, went to Yharnam, trained with Gehrman, became the best hunter the workshop ever produced. She spent her life doing exactly what the Church's project required hunters to do, with a quality of moral seriousness that almost no one else in Bloodborne's world demonstrates as clearly. She is the complication, not because her existence proves the executioners wrong, not because the existence of one good person in a lineage means the lineage cannot be dangerous. She is the complication because she demonstrates that the Vileblood inheritance was compatible with the specific quality of moral seriousness that Logarius spent his career trying to cultivate in the executioners. The inheritance did not prevent it, did not corrupt it, coexisted with it in her throughout the full length of the life she lived. This does not mean the framework was wrong. The framework was a description of a direction and a destination, and the direction and the destination could be real, even in a lineage that also produced people who never arrived there. Not everyone who carries a heritable tendency expresses it fully. Not every person in the Cainhurst line would have moved in the direction and to the destination that the framework identified as the danger. But the castle was full of people, specific individual people who were more than the tendency. Some of them were probably closer to what the framework feared. Some of them were probably closer to what Maria demonstrated was possible. The framework did not distinguish. The mission did not distinguish. The executioners went through the rooms, and the rooms contained the full range of what the Vileblood inheritance produced in the people who carried it, and the mission addressed them all with the same response. Logarius knew this was true and held the framework sound anyway, because the framework was describing the direction, and the direction was real, and the destination was dangerous, and the containing of the inheritance, even at the cost of the full range of what the inheritance could produce in its carriers, was what the situation required. He held this, alongside the knowledge of what it cost. He held it. Now bring in the executioners. The Healing Church did not invent the executioners in a single moment of institutional decision-making. It grew them, over time, in response to the specific pressures that the blood ministration program produced as the program scaled from a small and carefully managed operation to the large and necessarily less carefully managed institution that Yharnam's demand for healing required it to become. The early years of the Church's healing program were years of close oversight. The scholars who had come from Byrgenwerth with Lawrence knew the blood well enough to know what to watch for, knew the signs of the accumulation of effects that the blood's longer-term relationship with a recipient produced, knew how to distinguish the healing from the changing, and how to respond when the changing outpaced the healing in ways that the program's protocols were designed to prevent. The early years were careful years, cautious years, years in which the people administering the blood were still close enough to the scholarship that had produced their understanding of it to remember what the scholarship had found and what it had warned against. The scaling changed this. Scaling always changes the close oversight. You cannot maintain the specific quality of individual attention that careful work requires when the number of cases multiplies past the point that individual attention can address them all. You develop protocols. You train practitioners in the protocols rather than in the scholarship underlying the protocols. You create the institutional apparatus that allows the work to be done at scale, which is a different apparatus from the one that allows the work to be done with full understanding. The church scaled. The blood ministration reached more people. The healing was real, and the demand was real, and the scaling was the response to the demand. And the protocols replaced the scholarship for most of the practitioners, which meant the scholarship's specific warnings became institutional procedures rather than understood principles, which meant the procedures were followed in the cases they were designed for and failed in the cases they were not designed for because the practitioners did not understand the principle well enough to recognize when the principle required a different procedure. In this context, in the accumulating consequences of the scaling, certain kinds of problems began to appear that the ordinary hunt was not designed to address. Not the beast. The beast was visible, and the hunt had protocols for the beast that were well understood and reliably applied. These subtler problems, the problems of the blood-moving people in directions that were not the beast direction, and that were therefore not legible through the hunt's standard diagnostic framework. The Vileblood inheritance was the most concentrated and most serious of these problems. But the Vileblood was a concentration of something that the scaling had been producing in less concentrated forms across the church's broader patient population for years. People who were changing in ways that the ordinary ministration protocols did not account for. People whose changing was not toward the beast and not toward the obvious kinward transformation that the dungeon expeditions had documented, but toward something in between. Something the institutional vocabulary did not have a clean name for. The executioners emerged from the church's need to address these cases, not immediately as a fully formed institution with a complete theological framework and a specific mission and a name, as a practice first, a set of responses that certain practitioners developed for certain kinds of cases. The responses became a tradition. The tradition acquired the theological framework. The framework acquired the institutional structure. The institutional structure acquired the name. By the time Logarius came to the order, it was already an old tradition, already had its history and its accumulated practices and its specific way of talking about what it did and why. He did not invent the framework. He verified it and extended it and made it more rigorous than it had been and built in the Order's culture the specific insistence on understanding that had not been there before him in the form he made it take. But the foundation was older than him. He knew this. He held the tradition's history alongside his own engagement with it. Knowing where something comes from is part of understanding it correctly, and Logarius understood the Order correctly, which is to say, including the parts of its history that complicated the clean account of a divinely sanctioned institution pursuing a clearly justified mission. The complications did not destabilize the conviction. They were part of what the conviction had to account for, and he had accounted for them honestly. He carried that honest accounting up the steps of Cainhurst. the framework and its limits, the tradition and its history, the conviction and the full weight of what the conviction was built on. Not what they believed, what they were built around. There is difference. An institution is built around a function. The beliefs come after, or alongside, or get layered on top of the function to give it legitimacy and to make the people performing it feel that the performance is justified. The function of the executioners was the removal of threats to the healing church's project that the ordinary apparatus of the hunt could not address. Beasts the hunters could handle. The scourge was the hunt's domain. But a noble house carrying a heritable corruption of the old blood, people who were not beasts and were not showing the signs of the scourge and could not be addressed as threats under the hunt's normal categories, this required something different. The something different was the executioners. They were not simply fighters. This is the first and most important thing to establish, because it is the thing that made Logarius the right person to lead them, rather than simply the most capable fighter available. The executioners were built around judgment, the specific capacity to assess a situation and determine whether the thing they were looking at constituted the kind of threat their function was designed to address, and if it did, to address it with the full weight of the institutional authorization they carried. Judgment requires understanding. You cannot judge correctly what you do not understand, and the executioners from the beginning were built with the understanding as part of the function rather than separate from it. The scholars who developed the theological framework that justified the order's existence, the specific reasoning about the old blood and the Vileblood corruption and why the corruption required the response that the order provided, were not separate from the order. They were the order. The scholars and the fighters were the same people, trained in both the reasoning and the practice, expected to hold both simultaneously in a way that most military orders do not ask of their members. This is what made the executioners expensive to produce. You cannot train a person to fight effectively and think seriously at the same time if you are in a hurry. The Healing Church's main hunting apparatus, the holy blades, and the various other arms of the institutional hunt, was designed to be scalable. You could train hunters in cohorts, apply a curriculum, produce practitioners of the hunt in large numbers without requiring each of them to have done the intellectual work of understanding from first principles why the hunt was justified and what limits that justification placed on their conduct. The executioners could not be trained that way. The judgment that was their central function required the understanding, and the understanding required time and attention that the scalable model did not provide. You could not produce an executioner the way you produced a holy blade. You had to develop one, slowly through the specific process of a person who starts with the questions and works their way to the answers and arrives, at the end of the working, at a conviction that is their own rather than the institution's, that can sustain itself under pressure because it was formed under pressure rather than given as a conclusion. Logarius was the fullest expression of what this development model produced. He had done the work, not simply absorbed the tradition, not simply accepted the framework that the order had inherited from the scholars who built it, but gone back to first principles and reasoned his way through to the conclusions himself, verified the framework against his own thinking, arrived at the same place the tradition arrived at, through a process of genuine reasoning rather than institutional acceptance. This made his conviction different from the conviction of a person who believes what they have been taught. It had roots, the specific deep roots of a belief that has been grown rather than installed, and roots are what you need when the wind comes, which at Cainhurst it did, and hard. Before we follow Logarius into Cainhurst, one more thing about the order and what it believed. Not the abstract framework, but the specific texture of how the believing felt from inside it. The executioners who were serious about the work, and Logarius insisted they all be serious about it, did not experience the theological framework as an external justification imposed on them from above. They experienced it the way you experience a conclusion you've reasoned your way to yourself, which is as something that feels internal, that feels like part of how you think, rather than part of what you've been told to think. This is the specific achievement of Logarius's training method. He did not tell his hunters that the framework was correct. He walked them through the reasoning. He gave them the premises and the evidence and the chain of argument that connected the premises to the conclusions, and he let them arrive at the conclusions themselves, which meant the conclusions they arrived at felt like theirs, not the institution's, not theirs. This is a more durable form of conviction and a more dangerous one. More durable because conclusions that feel internal do not shake when the institution shakes, do not dissolve when authority structures change, do not require ongoing institutional reinforcement to maintain. More dangerous because conclusions that feel internal are harder to examine honestly. The distance that honest self-examination requires between the examiner and the examined is harder to maintain when the thing being examined feels like part of the self, rather than a belief the self holds. Logarius knew this. It was one of the complications he held alongside the framework. The specific risk of an order whose training method produced convictions that felt internal, which was that the hunters who held those convictions would be less likely to notice when the convictions needed updating than they would have been if the convictions had felt external, and therefore examinable. He compensated by building the checking practice into the culture rather than leaving it to individual initiative. He made the regular examination of the conviction part of the order's shared practice rather than a private discipline. This reduced the risk. It did not eliminate it. The theological framework itself deserves a moment. Not the full scholarly apparatus, the complete structure of argument that the Church's scholars had built over years of study, but the core of it. The thing that the framework was designed to establish, and that Logarius had verified through his own reasoning. The old blood moved people in a direction. This is the central premise. The blood was not a neutral substance that simply healed and left the recipient where it found them. It was a substance with the direction built into it, a direction determined by the specific Great One whose reality the blood channeled, and the direction it moved people in was determined by which Great One's influence ran through the particular blood in question. The legitimate old blood, the blood the Church distributed through its ministration program, moved people in a direction the Church could manage. Not always safely, not without consequences. The scourge was the consequence of the direction taken too far or too fast. But in a direction the Church understood and had developed protocols for monitoring and addressing. The Vileblood moved people in a different direction. This is the technical meaning of the word corruption, as the Church used it. Not morally corrupt in the first instance, though moral corruption was how the Church presented it to the public. Directionally corrupt. Moving in a direction the Church could not manage because the direction was determined by a Great One, whose relationship to the old blood was not the relationship that the Church's understanding was built around. A different entity, a different influence, a different destination for the people who carried the blood long enough to be moved to it. The destination was not the beast. The Vilebloods were not becoming beasts. They were becoming something else, something that the Church's framework did not have a clean category for, and that the Church's scholarship identified as dangerous in ways that were different from and in some respects more serious than the danger of the beast, because the beast was visible, the beast was in the streets, and the hunters could address it, and the church could maintain the narrative that the hunt was managing the blood's consequences effectively. The Vileblood's destination was not visible in the same way. It was more subtle and more heritable and more capable of existing within a social structure, within a noble house, within a lineage, without announcing itself as the problem the church's framework identified it as. This is what Logarius understood when he reasoned his way through to the framework's conclusions, not simply that the Vilebloods were dangerous, that the specific way they were dangerous made them uniquely difficult to address through the ordinary means available to the hunt, and that the difficulty was not going to diminish over time but increase as the lineage continued and the inheritance propagated through new generations, and the blood moved each generation further in the direction that the framework identified as the wrong one. He believed this. He had checked it against his own thinking and found it sound, and the believing was the foundation of everything that came after. Here is what you need to know about Logarius before Cainhurst, not his full biography, not the complete account of his formation and his career, and the specific events that produced the person who climbed the castle steps, the essential things, the things that Cainhurst would test. He was rigorous, not simply intelligent, not simply capable of thinking clearly in the way that most people who are good at thinking are capable of. Rigorous in the specific sense of a person who holds themselves to a standard of reasoning that most people do not apply to themselves, who checks their own conclusions against the evidence rather than accepting them because they feel right, who treats the difference between being right and feeling right as a distinction that matters enormously and is easy to miss if you are not constantly attending to it. This rigour applied to everything. It applied to his understanding of the Order's mission and the theological framework that justified it. It applied to his assessment of the hunters he trained, and the specific qualities they brought to the work and what those qualities meant for how they should be deployed and developed. It applied to his understanding of himself, which was more honest and more uncomfortable than self-understanding usually is. Because the standard he applied to the evidence of the external world, he also applied to the evidence of his own interior life. He knew his tendencies. He knew that he was capable of certainty in excess of what the evidence warranted, that the specific quality of his conviction, its depth and its rootedness, was both a strength and a vulnerability, because conviction that runs deep is hard to update even when the evidence requires updating. He compensated for this consciously, deliberately, through the practice of checking his conclusions regularly rather than simply holding them, of asking himself whether the thing he believed was still the thing the evidence supported, or whether the evidence had moved and the belief had not. This is the thing about Logarius that the game does not have room to show you, and that the lore points toward without fully rendering. The active, ongoing, effortful maintenance of intellectual honesty in a person whose conviction was strong enough that the honesty did not come naturally. He worked at it, every day, in the specific way that a person works at something that does not come naturally, with the awareness that the working was necessary, and that stopping would let the natural tendency reassert itself. He was lonely in the way that people who think at a certain level are always lonely, not unhappy, not isolated in a way that he experienced as deprivation, but operating at a level of intellectual seriousness that most of the people around him, including most of the people in the order he led, could not fully follow. The conversations he most wanted to have about the deepest questions the work raised and the specific ways those questions complicated the framework he had built around them, were conversations he could rarely have because the people available to have them with were rare. He found some of them in the hunters he trained. This was the specific pleasure of his leadership, the pleasure that made the demanding nature of what he asked of his hunters feel like more than simply an imposition of his own standards on people who had not chosen those standards. The moments when a hunter he had pushed hard on the philosophical questions arrived at something genuine, at a real engagement with the material rather than a performance of engagement, and he could hear in their questions that they were actually thinking rather than trying to give him the answers they thought he wanted. Those moments were the compensation for the loneliness, brief, real, the specific pleasure of a mind that has been working alone for a long time, making actual contact with another mind. He went to Cainhurst carrying all of this, the rigour and the conviction and the loneliness and the specific quality of leadership that had produced in the hunters who served under him something more than technical competence. He went carrying the framework that he had verified through his own reasoning and the awareness that the framework had limits, and the specific intellectual honesty that made him hold both of these things simultaneously, rather than letting the confidence in the framework crowd out the awareness of its limits. He was prepared for many things. He was not fully prepared for the castle. There is one more thing about him that matters before Cainhurst. The specific quality of his relationship to the people he trained, not leadership as an abstract quality, not the management of an institution's human resources toward the achievement of institutional goals, something more personal than that. He cared about them in the way that a person cares about people who've been entrusted to them by a situation more than by a choice. He did not choose the hunters who came to him. The order sent them. But the act of training someone seriously, of investing in them the kind of attention that genuine teaching requires, produces a form of care that does not wait for the choosing. You pay the attention, and the care arrives as a consequence of the paying, the way that knowing someone deeply enough always produces a stake in what happens to them. He knew what each of them was afraid of, not in the operational sense of knowing what situations to avoid sending them into, though he knew that too, in the pastoral sense, the specific fears that the work produced in serious people who thought carefully about what they were doing, the fear of being wrong about the framework, the fear of the cost being too high, the fear of the specific moment in an engagement, when the thing the engagement requires exceeds what you can give without losing something that cannot be recovered. He had conversations with his hunters about these fears, not the conversations of a superior addressing the psychological vulnerabilities of subordinates to optimize their performance. Real conversations, the kind where both people say things that are true rather than things that are useful, where the person with more authority acknowledges the hardness of what the authority requires of the person with less, not to excuse the requirement but to honour the cost of meeting it. These conversations were the part of his leadership that the institutional record does not contain, and that the people who had them did not forget. They went to Cainhurst carrying not just the framework and the conviction and the training, but the specific quality of being known by the person who sent them, of having been taken seriously as the specific people they were, rather than as interchangeable instances of the role they filled. Most of them did not come back from Cainhurst. He carried that on the roof. The specific weight of the conversations and the specific names and the specific faces and the specific fears he had sat with held in the mind that the roof slowly refined into something harder and stranger, but never emptied of the record of what had been given to it. He was not fully prepared for the castle. This chapter is shorter than the others. The battle itself deserves that. Not the extended analytical treatment that the before and the after receive. The battle was not analytical, it was what it was, brief in the scale of what surrounded it, decisive in the sense that what it decided could not be undecided, and costly in ways that the institutional record of its outcome did not calculate. The executioners went through the castle, room by room, hall by hall, through the lit chandeliers and past the set tables, and into the spaces where the people were who had not had time or warning enough to be anywhere else. The specific sounds and the specific quality of what happened in each room are not recorded in any surviving document, because the institution that sent the executioners had strong reasons to ensure that the documentation of what happened at Cainhurst was sparse. What the institution recorded was the outcome. The Vilebbloods were destroyed, Cainhurst fell. The outcome is accurate as far as it goes. Cainhurst fell in the sense that the living institution it had been was ended. The people who had made it a living institution were gone. The specific world that the castle had housed and the lineage that the castle had sustained and the inheritance that the lineage had carried were ended in the most complete way available. Logarius moved through all of it. He saw all of it. He was the leader. There was nothing that happened in the castle that he did not authorize, or that he was not present for, or that fell outside the scope of what he had determined the mission required. He carried the full weight of that authorization in the specific way that a person carries the weight of something they have decided to do, rather than something that happened to them. He chose it. Room by room, he chose it. And then he found the Queen, Annalise, still there, in the throne room at the heart of the castle after everything else. The Undying Queen. He knew this was possible. The scholarship that had informed the Order's understanding of the Vileblood threat had not been silent about the specific properties of the Queen's persistence, the specific way that the inheritance at its source had a relationship with death that ordinary mortality did not describe. He knew it was possible. He had planned for the possibility in the way that a rigorous person plans for possibilities they would prefer not to encounter, holding the plan at the edge of the strategy rather than at its center, because planning for something too explicitly is a way of accepting it before the acceptance is required. The plan was insufficient, not wrong, not based on a misunderstanding of what the situation would present. Insufficient in the way that most plans are insufficient when the thing they were designed to address is actually in front of you rather than in the abstract. The gap between the planned response and the actual response is always larger than the planning anticipated, because the actual thing has specific qualities that the abstract version did not, and those specific qualities require responses that the planning did not account for. He stood in the throne room with Annalise before him. She was still the Queen, not diminished by the battle, not broken by the loss of the castle and the people and the world that the battle had ended, still entirely herself, in the specific way that certain people are still entirely themselves regardless of what the circumstances do around them, as though the circumstances are the weather and the self is the landscape and the weather changes, but the landscape simply is what it is. He could not make her stop being what she was. He tried, in the ways that the mission's planning had provided for, and the trying was insufficient for exactly the reason the scholarship had identified it would be insufficient, because the Vileblood inheritance at its source, in the Queen who was its origin, had a relationship with the ending of life that did not respond to the methods available to him. The battle was over. The mission was accomplished in every respect except the central one. The inheritance was contained in the person who had originated it. The person could not be permanently ended. The inheritance, therefore, could not be permanently ended through the method the mission had used. He looked at the crown, but before that, before the throne room and the Queen and the crown, the rest of the castle, what the game does not show you, and what the institutional record does not contain, and what Logarius carried on the roof through the centuries in the specific form that things you witnessed and cannot unwitness are carried, is the movement through the rooms, the specific texture of each room as the executioners pass through it, the people in the rooms, the way the chandeliers looked from inside the engagement rather than from the outside looking in. He remembered all of it, not because he wanted to, not because the remembering served the mission or justified the conviction or made the sitting on the roof any easier, because a mind that is serious about the full accounting does not get to choose what it retains. The accounting includes the rooms include the people include the specific details that the mind retains because the mind was present and paying the kind of attention that serious people pay to serious situations, and the retention is the cost of the attention. The castle was beautiful throughout. This is the detail that the institutional account of the assault does not record, and that the remembering always included. The beauty did not stop at the edge of the engagement. The chandeliers were still extraordinary in the rooms where the engagement happened. The objects were still what they were, the specific aesthetic tradition of a noble house that had been refining its sense of beauty for generations did not become less refined because the executioners were in the building. He had known this was possible, this specific dissonance between the beauty of the place and the work the place required. He had not known until he was in it what the dissonance would feel like, because knowing something is possible and being inside the actuality of it are different things, in a way that no amount of preparation fully bridges. He completed the work. This is what the institutional account accurately records. He did what the mission required, room by room, through the beauty and the dissonance and the full weight of the paying of the attention, he completed it. And then the throne room, and Annalise, and the insufficiency of the plan. He looked at the crown. Not a long deliberation. This is the thing about the moment that the story's drama might lead you to expect was drawn out, extended, a long night of terrible choice-making in the empty throne room of a castle that had just been emptied. It was not that. He was a rigorous person. He'd done the work of understanding the situation and what it required before the situation required him to do anything, and the work meant that when the moment arrived, the reasoning was already finished. The crown concealed the passage. Wearing the crown would maintain the concealment. The concealment maintained would keep the passage inaccessible. The passage inaccessible meant the queen could not be reached. The queen unreachable meant the inheritance could not propagate. The inheritance not propagating was the closest available approximation to the mission's intended outcome, given that the intended outcome was not achievable through the methods available. He needed to wear it. That was the logic. Simple in the specific way that the conclusions of rigorous reasoning are simple, not easy, not comfortable, not without cost, but clear, unambiguous. Not a conclusion that required him to wrestle with the evidence because the evidence only pointed one way. What required the wrestling was not the logic but the implications of the logic. The wearing was not temporary. There was no version of the wearing that ended after a month or a year or a decade when the institution could develop a different solution and he could hand the crown over. He was the solution. The wearing was the mechanism, and the mechanism had to run for as long as the problem required containing, which was as long as the queen persisted, which, based on everything the scholarship established about her persistence, was effectively indefinitely. He was going to stay on the roof for the rest of his life. This was the implication. Not a life that continued toward the horizon, in the ordinary way that lives continue, with the opening of new chapters and the changing of circumstances and the gradual development of the person through the accumulation of new experience. A life that had arrived at its final form and would continue in that form for as long as it continued at all. He checked this against the framework. He did what he always did when he arrived at a conclusion, which was to test it, to ask whether the conclusion still held when he looked at it from every available angle, whether there was an alternative he had not considered, whether the reasoning that had produced the conclusion was sound or whether it had a flaw that he had missed. It held. There was no alternative he had not considered. The reasoning was sound. He put the crown on his head. No ceremony, no witness, no record. One man in an empty throne room placing an object on his own head, because the situation required it, and he was the one who understood what the situation required, and therefore he was the one who would provide it. This is the moment. Everything before it is context. Everything after it is consequence. It is worth staying with the moment a little longer before we follow it into the consequence, not to dwell in it dramatically. Because the moment deserves the specific quality of attention it takes to understand what kind of moment it actually was. It was not a heroic moment in the way that heroic moments are usually rendered. There was no witness. There was no music. There was no swelling sense of significance arriving from outside the person making the choice to confirm to them that the choice they were making was the significant one. There was only the throne room, the empty castle around the throne room, the queen who would not stay ended, the crown, the logic. The logic was not comfortable. This is the thing about conclusions that have been reached through genuine, rigorous reasoning rather than arrived at through the easier route of feeling your way to what you want to be true. The logic was not comfortable, because rigorous reasoning does not make the conclusion comfortable. It makes it clear. Clarity and comfort are not the same thing, and in Logarius's case, at this moment, they were very far apart. He was about to give the rest of his life to a roof, not in the dramatic sense of a sacrifice made in a single moment of commitment, in the literal, ongoing, everyday sense of every morning that would come after this one being a morning on the roof rather than a morning anywhere else, every question he would have, every thought he would think, every moment of the specific pleasure of a serious mind encountering something interesting would happen on the roof, in the wind, with the crown. He knew this. He was not deceived about the scope of what the putting on of the crown meant. His rigour applied here as it applied everywhere. He did not allow himself the comfort of imagining that the institutional apparatus would develop an alternative solution quickly. He'd assessed the institution's likely response to the situation honestly, and found it insufficient, which is why he was making the choice he was making rather than returning to the institution. He understood the full scope. He put the crown on anyway. This is the moment. Everything before it is context. Everything after it is consequence. Time passes differently on a roof, not in the metaphorical sense of time seeming longer or shorter, depending on the quality of the experience. In the literal sense that the relationship between a person and time changes when the person's circumstances remove the ordinary markers that time uses to make itself felt. The season still came at Cainhurst, or something like them, the frost deepening and easing with whatever rhythms the castle's specific relationship to the ordinary world allowed. But the other markers, the ones that give time its texture in an ordinary life, the movement from one chapter to the next, the changes in circumstance and relationship, and the sense of being carried forward by something, were absent. He was not being carried forward, he was staying still. The world moved and he stayed still, and the relationship between himself and the moving world changed in ways that the staying still produced. In the first years, the staying still was a practice. It required the same daily recommitment that any sustained discipline requires, the active choosing of the thing again rather than simply continuing to do it through inertia. He recommitted every morning, or what passed for morning on the roof, to the conclusion that the staying was necessary, and therefore to the staying. He checked the conclusion. He found it sound. He stayed. The checking became less frequent as the years became decades. Not because the conclusion became less sound, but because the checking had established its soundness so many times that the checking itself became less necessary. The conclusion was not going to fail. He had tested it thoroughly. He knew it would hold. The testing could become less frequent without becoming less honest. The decades became something longer than decades. The checking became something more like the occasional, almost automatic verification that a person performs on things they know well. The brief confirmation that the thing is still where it should be, rather than the careful examination of a thing whose location is uncertain. And in the spaces between the checking, in the long unscheduled hours of the roof, the crown was doing what the crown did, not dramatically, not in a way that produced sudden and obvious transformation that he could have noticed and named if he'd been looking for it. Gradually, in the specific way that sustained proximity to something with the properties of a Cainhurst object, produced by the specific tradition and the specific inheritance of the castle's noble line, gradually reshapes the person who maintains sustained proximity to it. He became harder. This is the first and most legible thing the roof did to him. The specific quality of intellectual rigour that had always been his most distinctive characteristic, the willingness to hold a conclusion at a distance and examine it rather than simply inhabiting it, became over time less a practice and more a property. Less something he did and more something he was. The distance that rigorous thinking requires between the thinker and the thought calcified into a permanent distance between Logarius and everything. Not coldness in the emotional sense, not indifference to what the roof contained or what the mission meant or what the queen below him represented. A hardness, the specific hardness of a person whose careful, deliberate, sustained attention to a single thing for a very long time has reduced them to the essential form of that attention. He became strange. This is harder to describe, and it is the thing the game shows you most directly when you encounter him. The specific quality of wrongness in his presence, that is not the wrongness of the beast and not the wrongness of the kin, but something else, something that sits in the space between the human and those two directions, something that the crown produced through the years of wearing. He was not corrupted in the sense that the Vileblood scholarship described corruption. He was not moving in the direction that the Vileblood inheritance moved the people who carried it. He was moving in a direction that did not have a name because no one had been in his specific situation long enough for the direction to become a documented category. He became the roof. This is the most accurate way to say it, not metaphorically, in the specific sense that a person becomes what their sustained and total commitment to a single purpose over a very long time makes them. The roof was the purpose. The containing was the purpose. The maintaining of the concealment was the purpose, and he was the mechanism of the purpose, and the mechanism over the centuries took on the properties of what it was sustaining rather than remaining cleanly separate from it. He was still Logarius. The conviction was still there, still the organising principle of what he was and what he did, still the thing that the years had not eroded. The framework was still sound, the conclusion still held. But the person who held the conclusion was not the same person who'd arrived at it in the throne room of Cainhurst Castle in the aftermath of the battle. He was what that person had become through the process of holding it for as long as he had held it in the conditions that the holding required. This is what the roof did. This is the specific cost that the centuries extracted. Not his life, not his sanity in the complete sense, not even the conviction itself. The person he had been before the holding started, the leader and the teacher and the man who found his deepest pleasure in the moments of real intellectual contact with the hunters who studied under him. That person was not on the roof. What was on the roof was the distillation of that person, the essential remainder after everything that was not the conviction and the holding had been refined away by time and isolation and the specific influence of a crown that was doing what it was always doing, which was what Cainhurst objects do to the people who maintain long and sustained proximity to them. And then, after all of it, after the years and the decades and the centuries and the hardening and the strange becoming, a carriage on a road that should not exist, footsteps in the frozen halls below, someone climbing, but before that, before the climbing, the roof in the middle of the centuries, not at the beginning and not at the end, the middle, the part of the long thing that is hardest to describe because it does not have the drama of the decision or the resolution of the ending. It simply continues, day after day, in the wind. What does a rigorous mind do with centuries of unstructured time? It thinks. It cannot help but think. The thinking was always the primary activity, and the roof does not remove the activity, only changes its object. In the years before the roof there had been the scholarship and the hunters and the conversations and the ongoing work of the institution that gave the thinking its direction and its purpose and its productive friction against other minds. On the roof there was only the thinking itself turned inward and downward and outward at the frozen landscape below, finding its objects where it could. He thought about the framework, not in the way of a person who is uncertain about it and returns to it seeking reassurance, in the way of a person who has verified the framework thoroughly and continues to engage with it, because serious thinking always finds something new in the things it returns to, new implications and new angles, and new ways that the structure of the argument connects to other structures of argument that the original construction had not anticipated. He extended the framework on the roof, took it further than the original premises had been taken, followed its implications into territory that the Order's scholarship had not entered, developed from the sitting the specific kind of theoretical depth that sustained and solitary contemplation produces in minds capable of it. He thought about the people, the ones who had been in the castle and were gone, the ones who had come to him for training and were gone, the ones whose names and faces and specific qualities he held in the mind, that the roof was refining into something harder and stranger, but that retained the record of everything it had been given. He thought about them not as a practice of grief, not in the deliberate way of a person who has decided to mourn. They arrived, unbidden, in the specific way that the people we have known deeply always arrive in the mind that knew them, unexpectedly, at oblique angles, in the middle of a thought about something else, a detail of the framework or a property of the crown or the specific quality of the wind at a particular season, and then they were there, briefly, with the arbitrary precision that memory applies to the things it retains. He thought about what was right. This is the thinking that the roof both demanded and resisted. Demanded because a rigorous person in Logarius' situation cannot stop asking whether the thing they are doing is the right thing, cannot accept the conclusion that it is right without the ongoing verification that the conclusion still holds, resisted because the ongoing verification, when the conclusion always holds, eventually becomes something that is more like the motion of a mechanism than the motion of genuine thought. The checking happens and the answer is the same, and the checking happens again. After enough repetitions, the checking is still honest, but it is also a form of the isolation making itself felt. The mind going over the ground it knows, because the ground it knows is all that is available. The roof also did something to his relationship with time that the ordinary human relationship with time is not built for. Time, for people living ordinary human lives, is primarily an experience of moving, of being carried forward by the current of events and changes and the development of the self through new experience. On the roof the current stopped. The events were the same events. The changes were the changes of the weather and the frost, and the slow transformation that the crown was producing in him, none of which had the quality of the changes that time usually brings, which is the quality of being about something. The roof changes were not about anything. They were simply the effects of duration on a person and an object and a place. Duration without direction. He found his way through it. This is the thing about Logarius that the roof makes most clearly visible. The specific quality of a person who can sustain a commitment not because the conditions make sustaining it easy, but because the commitment itself is the condition. Not maintaining the holding, because it produces something that makes the maintaining feel worthwhile. Maintaining it because it is the thing that needs to be maintained and he is the one available to maintain it, and the rest of the experience, the wind and the hardening and the centuries of the same checking, arriving at the same answer, is simply what the maintaining costs. He paid continuously, without the ceremony of a single decisive payment that could be made and completed. The ongoing payment of the ongoing cost, day after day, in the wind with the crown. And then, after all of it, after the years and the decades and the centuries and the hardening and the strange becoming, a carriage on a road that should not exist, footsteps in the frozen halls below, someone climbing. Before the roof, before Cainhurst, a parenthesis on the people he made, the executioners that Logarius trained were not like other hunters, not simply more capable, not simply more philosophically sophisticated in the specific way that a demanding intellectual framework produces sophistication in the people who are seriously exposed to it. Different in the way they carried the work. Most hunters carry the hunt the way you carry a tool. You pick it up when you need it, you use it, you put it down. The tool does not become part of you in any sense that changes what you are when you're not using it. You are the person who uses the tool. The tool is the tool. There is a clean boundary between the two. The hunters Logarius trained could not maintain that boundary. He would not allow it. He believed, and he made them believe through the specific quality of the training he provided, that the hunt was not something you picked up and put down. It was something you were continuously, whether you were in the field or not. The moral seriousness that the work required did not stop when the engagement ended. It was ongoing. The questions the hunt raised about what the work was for and what it cost and what you owed, the people on the receiving end of it, and what limits the framework placed on your conduct. Even in the moment of the engagement, these questions did not resolve between hunts and resuming at the next one. They were the permanent condition of being a person who did this work. This made the hunters who trained with him carry something heavier than the hunters who trained without him. not heavier in the sense that the weight was a burden they resented, though some of them did resent it. The ones whose relationship to the work was more straightforward, and who found Logarius's insistence on the questions more taxing than illuminating. Heavier in the sense that the weight was real. The work weighed what it actually weighed, which was more than most of the institutional apparatus around them acknowledged, and Logarius would not allow the insulation against the actual weight that institutional frameworks typically provide. There was one he trusted most completely. The game does not preserve the name. The records of the executioners at this level of specificity did not survive the institutional dissolution that followed Cainhurst, or survived in fragments too small to reconstruct the individual from. But the evidence of the training, the specific quality of what Logarius built in the Order's culture, points toward the existence of someone who received not just the framework, but the deepest version of it. The version that included Logarius's own doubts about the framework, and his own methods of addressing those doubts, and his own understanding of where the framework's limits were, and what those limits required of the people who operated within them. Passing the deepest version of the framework on is a specific kind of trust. You only give someone your doubts if you believe they can hold them without being destabilized by them, without using the doubt as permission to abandon the conclusion that the doubt complicates. Logarius believed this of one person in the Order at least, and he gave that person the full account, the framework and the limits, the conclusion and the complication, the conviction and the honest acknowledgement that conviction is never as simple as it feels from the inside. That person went to Cainhurst with him, and is not on the roof. This is the loss that sits under everything else about the centuries of the sitting, not just the loss of a full life and a full self, and the ongoing work of a mind that had things left to do. The loss of the specific person who had been given the deepest version of what Logarius believed, and who could have, in a world where the battle had gone differently, carried that version forward after Logarius was gone. The loss of the continuity, the loss of the conversation that could only happen between two people who both held the full account. He held it alone after Cainhurst, the full account, the conviction and the complication both, held by one person in one mind in the wind on a roof with no one to share the holding with. The specific quality of alone that the roof produced is worth understanding before we follow it into the Order's dissolution, because alone on a roof is not the same as alone in a city, or alone in a crowd, or alone in the way that most people experience aloneness, which is the temporary absence of company in a world that contains company. The roof's aloneness was permanent in a way that those other forms are not. Not permanent in the sense that it could never end, in the sense that there was no prospect of it ending through ordinary means. You cannot walk to a place where other people are when you are the containment. You cannot seek out the company of people who understand what you are holding when the only people who understood it are gone. The alone is the condition, permanently until the condition itself ends. He had been a person who valued real conversation above almost everything, the specific pleasure of a serious mind making actual contact with another serious mind, the thing that the best of the hunters he trained had given him in the moments when they asked a question that revealed genuine engagement with the material rather than performed understanding. He had organised his leadership around the creation of conditions for this kind of contact, had built in the Order's culture the specific insistence on understanding, because understanding was the prerequisite for the real conversation, and the real conversation was the thing that made the serious work of the Order more than simply the execution of an institutional function. None of that was available on the roof. The Crown did not produce conversation partners. The wind did not ask questions. The frost did not push back on the framework in the productive way that another rigorous mind pushes back. He had the framework and the checking and the ongoing internal dialogue of a person who's always thought seriously and continues to think seriously, and has only themselves to think with. The internal dialogue is not nothing. A rigorous mind in conversation with itself is still a rigorous mind, still applying the standards, still arriving at conclusions and checking the conclusions and extending the framework into new territory. But it is not the same as two minds. It does not have the friction, the place where your blind spots are, the things your framework cannot see because your framework was built by you and therefore shares your blind spots. These are the things that only another mind encounters and challenges. Your own mind cannot encounter them because they are invisible to it by definition. He held thee alone, alongside the conviction, and the cost, and the framework, and the daily recommitment. He held it the way he held everything, which was fully and without pretending it was smaller than it was, and without letting it change the conclusion about what the situation required. The order dispersed. This happened not immediately, not in the days after the assault, but over the years that followed as the Church processed the outcome and made the institutional decisions that the outcome produced. The executioners had completed their mission. The institutional logic of an organization whose specific purpose has been fulfilled pointed clearly toward dissolution or absorption. The Church absorbed what the order had been into its broader apparatus, incorporated the tradition and the weapons and the hunting culture that the order had developed into the general practice of the hunt, and the executioners as a distinct institution ceased to exist. The hunters who had survived and returned, the ones who had not been at Cainhurst, or who had been at Cainhurst in roles that did not put them in the castle itself, found themselves practitioners of a tradition that no longer had an institutional home. They carried what they had been given, the weapons and the methods, and, in some cases, some version of the philosophical framework, the insistence on understanding, the commitment to holding the moral weight of the work consciously, rather than letting the institutional apparatus carry it for them. They carried these things into whatever context the dissolution left them in. But the framework without the institution that had produced and maintained it changed as it was transmitted without Logarius to transmit it. The deepest version, the one that included the doubts alongside the conclusions and the limits of the framework alongside the framework itself, and the specific quality of an honest self-examination that Logarius had insisted was inseparable from the practice. This version required Logarius to transmit it correctly. It required the specific quality of attention he had paid to the specific people he had paid it to. The conversations that had happened at the level of the real rather than the level of the performed. The acknowledgement of the hardness that only a person who understood the hardness could honestly make. Without him, the framework simplified. The conclusions without the complications. The practice without the full account of what the practice cost. The weapons and the methods and the title executioner and the theological vocabulary of correction and contamination, and the specific way the order had talked about what it did and why. Without the specific quality of honest engagement with the questions, the doing raised that had been the foundation of what made the framework legitimate, rather than simply useful. He did not know this was happening. He was on the roof. The order dissolved and the tradition simplified, and the name executioner continued in the world, in a form that was recognizably descended from what he had built, and that had lost the most important thing he had built, which was the insistence on understanding, and he sat in the wind with the crown on his head, and had no way of knowing. He held it alone after Cainhurst. The full account, the conviction and the complication both, held by one person in one mind in the wind on a roof with no one to share the holding with. She's still there. The throne room is at the heart of the castle below the roof where Logarius sits. You reach it by using the crown he wore, by taking it from him after the fight and using its concealment-revealing property to find the passage that the wearing concealed. You descend from the roof where he was, and you find her in the room that the concealment was protecting. She is still the queen. This is the thing that the centuries have not taken from her, and that Logarius's sustained presence on the roof could not take from her, and that the assault on the castle and the loss of everything the castle contained could not take from her. The sovereign sense of herself, the specific, complete, undiminished identity of a person who knows precisely what they are, and does not require external confirmation of it to maintain the knowing. She is the queen of the Vilebloods. She is the origin of the inheritance. She is the undying sovereign of a lineage that has no one left to carry it except the people who come to the throne room after following the passage that the crown concealed. She offers you the covenant. Come, be what we are, carry what we carry. She does not explain herself. She does not justify the Vileblood inheritance, or argue against the Church's account of it, or present a defence of what Cainhurst was and what it deserved. She simply offers. The inheritance is available. The Queen persists. If you want what she can give, it is yours. There is a dignity in this offer that is worth sitting with. She has survived everything. The assault, the loss of the castle and the court and the lineage and the people, the centuries of the frozen aftermath, the crown on the head of the man on the roof, maintaining the concealment that kept the passage hidden and the inheritance contained. She survived all of it, and she is still in the throne room, and she is still making the offer, and the offer is still the offer it always was, not diminished by the centuries, not made desperate by the loss, just the offer. She is not asking for your sympathy. She is not performing grief at what was taken from her, or anger at the people who took it. She is simply the Queen, offering what the Queen offers in the specific and complete way that she has always offered it. Now the complication. Logarius contained this. He wore the crown for centuries to keep the passage to this room hidden, to prevent anyone from reaching the Queen and accepting the inheritance, because the inheritance was the thing the mission had determined needed to be contained. He paid everything the containing cost, and you came and you took the crown from him, and you used it to find the passage, and you are standing here now. Was he right to contain it? This is not a question the game answers. It is a question the game puts in front of you, through the specific architecture of what you have to do to reach this room, and what you find when you reach it. You had to defeat Logarius. You had to take from him the thing he gave everything to maintain. And what you find on the other side of that taking is a woman in a throne room who is still the Queen, and who is still making an offer, and who does not seem, from where you are standing, to be the catastrophic threat that the centuries of containment suggested she was. She might be. The Church's assessment of what the Vileblood inheritance represented might be entirely correct, and the offer she is making might be the most dangerous thing in the game's world, in ways that are not immediately visible, because the danger is not the kind that announces itself. The inheritance's direction, the specific way it moves the people who carry it, and the destination it is moving them toward, might be exactly what the framework identified it as, and the Queen's persistence might be exactly the ongoing threat that required exactly the containment that Logarius provided. Or she might be a person, a sovereign who survived a massacre, a woman whose lineage was ended and whose people were destroyed, and who persists in the frozen aftermath of what was done to her world with the specific completeness of someone who refuses to let what was done to her define what she is, or both, most likely both. The danger might be real, and she might be a person, and the question of whether what Logarius did was just might not have a clean answer, because the situations that produce the question of whether something was just are rarely the situations that clean answers fit. Logarius held the containment for centuries. He is not here to answer the question. He is on the roof, in whatever state the ending of the fight and the ending of the centuries left him in, no longer in the position of providing the answer through his continued presence. The crown is in your hands, the passage is open, the queen is in the throne room. What you do with the offer is yours to decide. But before you decide, sit with the specific quality of what the offer is, not the theological implications or the strategic considerations of what accepting or declining means for the knight's logic, just the offer itself, what it says about the person making it and the centuries that produce this moment. She has been waiting in this room for as long as Logarius has been on the roof. This is the thing that the parallel between them makes visible when you hold them both in your attention at the same time. He was above, containing. She was below, contained. Two people in the same frozen castle, separated by the passage that the crown concealed, each persisting through the centuries in their own form of the same fundamental situation, which was the situation of being held in a place that had stopped by something that would not allow the place to change. His persistence was a choice, sustained daily through the recommitment. Hers is a property, the specific relationship with ending that the Vileblood inheritance at its source has, which does not require choosing and cannot be ended by choosing differently. He could have left, in the sense that the decision to stay was a decision, and decisions can in principle be unmade. She could not have left in any sense, because what she is does not permit the leaving. She's been alone in this room for as long as he has been on the roof. Think about that. The castle is frozen. The castle has been frozen for the full duration of the centuries. The people who set the tables are not coming back to eat at them. The people who lit the chandeliers are not coming back to sit under them. The world that the castle was built to house is gone, and she has been in this room, the last living piece of what the castle was, in the specific aloneness of a person who is the last of a thing that used to be more. She does not show you this. The specific quality of her presentation when you reach her is not the quality of a person who has been through centuries of aloneness in a frozen castle, and carries the full weight of it visibly. She is still the queen. The sovereignty has not been diminished by the isolation, has not frayed at the edges in the way that human beings fray at the edges when the conditions of their existence are hostile to human flourishing for long enough. She persists in the complete form. Whether this completeness is a strength or its own kind of damage is a question the game does not answer, and that Bloodborne tends to leave in the hands of the person who is looking. Some people look at Annalise and see dignity, a person who survived what was done to her world and retained herself through the surviving. Some people look at her and see the specific horror of an existence that cannot end and cannot change and cannot be other than what it is, regardless of what happens around it. Both readings are available. The object, the queen in the throne room, supports both. Logarius contained her because the framework identified her as a danger. The framework was rigorous and honestly arrived at and almost certainly correct about the technical question of what the Vileblood inheritance was and what direction it moved the people who carried it. And she is a person alone in a frozen room, still making the offer that she has always made, with the specific completeness of someone who has not been broken by what was done to her, and who persists in the form that the thing she is allows her to persist in. Both of these things are true. The framework is sound and she is a person, and the truth of one does not cancel the truth of the other. Logarius understood this on the roof. He held the framework sound, and he held the full accounting of what the framework had required, and the accounting included her. What you do with the offer is yours to decide. The Healing Church named him Martyr. At some point after the assault on Cainhurst, after the institutional account of the outcome had been processed and incorporated into the Church's official narrative of its own history, someone in the institutional apparatus decided that the word for Logarius was martyr, and the word was applied and it stuck. The word is accurate in the sense that it points towards something real. He suffered for what he believed. The suffering was genuine. The believing was genuine. The relationship between the two, the specific way that the believing produced the suffering rather than the suffering simply happening to a person who happened to believe things, is what the word is designed to describe, and it describes it correctly in Logarius's case. The word is insufficient in the sense that it contains none of what the roof contained. It does not contain the crown, or the passage, or the queen who persists. It does not contain the specific nature of what Logarius did in the aftermath of the battle, the improvised and unwitnessed decision to maintain a containment that the mission had not designed, for using a method that the mission had not anticipated. It does not contain the transformation, the gradual hardening and strangening that the centuries and the crown produced in the person who had been the Order's most rigorous thinker. It does not contain the loss of the hunters who went to the castle and did not come back. The Church's account says Logarius led the executioners against Cainhurst. The Vilebloods were destroyed. He gave his life in the completion of the mission. He is the martyr. Every sentence in that account is true in the sense of not being factually wrong, and the account as a whole misses the most important thing about what happened, which is that the mission was not completed in the way the account implies it was completed, that the staying on the roof was not the giving of a life in the conventional martyrdom sense of a life ended in the service of a cause, but the giving of a life in the much more specific and much more costly sense of a life, continued beyond its natural conclusion in permanent service of a containment the institution did not know was necessary. He did not die at Cainhurst. He continued at Cainhurst. The distinction between dying for something and continuing for something past, the point that continuing resembles living, is a distinction that the word martyr does not make, and that the Church's account does not make, and that requires the full story to make visible. The full story is this. A man reasoned his way to a conviction about something important. He followed the conviction to a castle. The castle produced a situation the conviction had not prepared him for. He improvised a response. He maintained the response for centuries at a cost that the institution that sent him did not know he was paying. He was transformed by the maintenance into something that was still the conviction, but was no longer entirely the man, and he held on, alone, in the wind, until something stronger arrived. That is the story the word martyr is pointing at. Imperfectly, insufficiently, in the specific way that single words always point at complex realities imperfectly and insufficiently, but pointing. He was the martyr, in the full sense, and the insufficient sense and the gap between the two, which is where his actual experience lived. There is a specific cruelty in being named correctly for the wrong reasons. Not malicious cruelty, not the cruelty of an institution that knows the full story and chooses to misrepresent it. The cruelty of an institution that does not know the full story and cannot therefore tell it, that names what it can see and cannot see what it cannot see, and whose naming, for all its accuracy within its limits, makes the fuller truth harder to locate because the name sounds complete. Martyr Logarius. The name sounds complete. It sounds like the full account of a person whose story has been told, and whose significance has been recognised, and whose cost has been honoured. It sounds like there is nothing more to know, like the knowing is done. The knowing is not done. The knowing is barely started at the level of what the name contains. The roof is not in the name. The crown is not in the name. The queen is not in the name. The specific nature of the decision in the throne room and the specific transformation that the centuries produced, and the specific daily recommitment in the wind and the frost, none of this is in the name. The name contains the suffering and the belief. It does not contain the content of either. It points toward a person and tells you the person was a martyr, and leaves the specific texture of the martyrdom, the actual lived reality of what it consisted of and what it cost, to be found by anyone willing to go to the castle and climb the steps and take the crown, and use it to find the passage and stand in the throne room and ask what it took to keep the passage hidden for as long as it was hidden. The church cannot be blamed for this entirely. The church named what it knew. What it knew was limited because Logarius had not returned to tell it what the situation required, and had therefore not provided the full account. The insufficiency of the name is partly the consequence of the choice that produced the roof, the choice not to return, which was the right choice, and which also produced, as a side effect, the institutional ignorance that produced the insufficient name. He would not have minded the insufficiency, or minded it in the way that a person minds something that is wrong but cannot be helped, and that does not change what actually happened, which is the only version that matters. He did what he did. The name does not change what he did. The institutional account does not change what he did. The roof was the roof, and the crown was the crown, and the centuries were the centuries, and all of that is true regardless of what the church called him. He was the martyr. In the full sense and the insufficient sense and the gap between the two, which is where his actual experience lived. You go to Cainhurst, not because anyone sends you. The game does not send you to Cainhurst the way it sends you to the Cathedral Ward or the Forbidden Woods. It hides Cainhurst. It requires you to find the sinister messenger, to acquire the summons, to go to a specific place at a specific time to catch the carriage on the road that should not be a road. The game makes you choose to go. This is deliberate. Cainhurst is not the kind of place the night's main logic brings you to. It is the kind of place you find when you're looking for what the main logic is not showing you. The carriage takes you through the fog. The road through the fog is not an ordinary road, and the fog is not ordinary fog. It is the boundary between what the city acknowledges and what it has decided not to acknowledge, and passing through it has the quality that all such boundaries have in Bloodborne. The sense of leaving one set of rules behind and entering a space where different things are possible and different things are real. The castle is frozen when you arrive. You walk through the halls. You see the chandeliers still lit and the table still set and the stopped moment still stopped. You understand without being told that this place ended at a specific point and has been that point ever since. You feel the specific weight of a place that used to be full of people and is not anymore, in the way that you always feel that weight when the architecture is still intact and the objects are still in place, and only the people are gone. You climb. The roof is cold, the wind is there, the man in the chair is there, transformed by what the centuries did to him into something that is still recognisably human and is also clearly not entirely what it was. He looks at you. He knows what you are in the way that he has always known what hunters are, in the specific trained recognition of a person whose entire career was spent assessing the people who came to him and determining what they were capable of. You are capable of ending him. He rises. The man who's been sitting in one place for longer than most things last stands up, and what stands up is not the diminished remainder of confinement, but the refined essence of a person who has been thinking about one thing for centuries. The unnecessary has been burned away. The habitual, the imprecise, the accumulated softness of a craft that is practiced regularly, and therefore never fully concentrated, all of this is gone. What remains is the core. He fights with the core. It is extraordinary, not in spite of the centuries of stillness, but because of them. Because the stillness was not absence of the craft, but concentration of it. The reduction of everything to its essential form through the patient application of thought that ongoing practice does not allow time for. He moves with the specific precision of a thing that has been refined past the point of personal style, past the point of the individual habit and the personal preference and the accumulated idiosyncrasy of a practitioner, to the principle underneath. The pure expression of what the craft actually is when everything that is not the craft has been removed. He will kill you, probably more than once. The deaths at his hands are not the deaths of a person being overwhelmed by something stronger. They are the deaths of a person encountering something more refined than they are currently refined enough to meet. You have to become more refined. You have to understand what he is doing at the level of principle rather than the level of pattern, because the patterns change and the principle does not, and fighting the pattern is a strategy that will fail, and fighting the principle is the only strategy that works. When you defeat him, the fight ends in the specific way that the fights at the end of long things end. Not with triumph in the clean sense, with something more complicated. The man who has been on the roof for centuries has been met by the thing the roof was always waiting for. The hunter capable of ending what he could not end himself, and the ending is happening. And in the ending there is something that is not quite grief and not quite relief, and sits in the space between them where only very long things that are finally concluding tend to sit. The crown is yours. He had it. Now you have it. It passed from Cainhurst to Logarius to you, through the battle and the centuries and the fight on the roof, carrying in its weight the full history of everything that has been done and sustained and paid in the space between where it came from and where it is now. Use it carefully, but stay on the roof for another moment before the using, before the descent and the throne room and the offer. Stay with what just happened here and what it means in the context of everything that preceded it. The fight was not simply a fight. It was the conclusion of the longest continuous act of will in Bloodborne's world. Longer than Gehrman in the dream, who had the moon presence's architecture sustaining the continuation. Longer than Willem at the lake, who had the transformation doing its slow work on the form that the continuation took. Logarius was sustained by nothing except his own conviction. No cosmic entity supporting the arrangement, no transformation remaking him into a form suited to the indefinite continuation. Just the man and the choice, and the daily recommitment and the crown doing what the crown did to the person wearing it, while the person wearing it kept choosing to wear it. That ended here. The ending required you. This is the specific thing about the fight that makes it more than a mechanical obstacle in the path to the throne room. It required a hunter capable of meeting what the centuries had made of the man, which is to say a hunter who had gone deep enough into the knight's logic to have been refined by it, in ways that made them equal to what the roof's refinement had produced. The fight was between two forms of refinement, the roof and the hunt, the sustained stillness and the sustained movement, the centuries of solitary contemplation and the accumulation of a single night's hard-won understanding. You were equal to it, or you learned to be equal to it, across however many attempts the roof required of you. The learning is part of the story. Each time you were defeated and returned, you understood something more about the principle underneath the pattern. Each time the wind took you down, you got back up with a slightly more accurate understanding of what you were facing. This is the hunt's version of what the roof did to Logarius, which is the refinement of something through the sustained application of serious attention. The hunt refines through repeated encounter, the roof refined through solitary contemplation. Both arrived at something essential. His essential form met your essential form on the roof in the wind of the frozen castle, and one of them was more essential than the other at that specific moment in the specific conditions of that specific fight. Yours was, and the centuries concluded. He fell in the space where he had held the thing he held. Among the frost and the wrong sky and the wind that is still there after the fall, because the wind does not care about the fall, and the crown was there for the taking, use it carefully. Pull back, not far, not to the distance where the specific events blur into the general shape of a life. Just far enough to see the whole arc at once, the man in the workshop, the man on the roof, the centuries between them. Logarius was about conviction held past the point that conviction is comfortable. This sounds simple, it is not. Conviction that is comfortable is not the same thing as conviction that is held past the point that it is comfortable. Comfortable conviction is the conviction of a person whose circumstances support the belief and whose daily experience reinforces it, and who has not yet encountered the specific conditions that reveal what the belief actually costs. Logarius's conviction was never the comfortable kind. He built it through rigorous self-examination at the beginning, and he maintained it through rigorous self-examination across the centuries, and the examination was always honest, and the honesty always found the conviction sound, and the soundness never made the holding easy. He was right. This is the uncomfortable thing to say, and the thing the story demands be said. He was right about the Vileblood inheritance being a danger that required containing. He was right that the assault on Cainhurst was the response the situation required. He was right that the crown needed to be worn after the battle produced a situation the mission had not designed for. He was right in the specific and costly way that being right about something serious always costs, which is everything the rightness requires, and nothing held back, because the holding back would be the same as being wrong. He was also alone with the rightness in the way that rightness does not account for. The rightness does not provide company, does not provide warmth or the specific pleasure of a mind making contact with another mind in the full account of what is known, does not provide the continuation of the life that existed before the rightness was fully expressed, the workshops and the conversations and the specific people whose presence gave the life its texture. The rightness simply is, and the person who is right is alone with it. He carried something else alongside the rightness, the full accounting, the knowledge that the castle had been full of people, that the people had been more than the category, that the specific individuals who had carried the inheritance were not reducible to the danger the inheritance represented. He did not carry this as guilt, not in the way that guilt works when a person has done something they believe was wrong. He had not done something he believed was wrong. He carried it as weight, the specific weight of a right action that had a real cost to real people, held alongside the rightness without pretending the cost was smaller than it was or that the rightness cancelled it. Both things, the conviction and the cost, simultaneously, in the same person, for centuries, on a roof in the wind with a crown that was changing him and a passage that was staying hidden, and a queen below who persisted through it all. He also was about service without witness. This is the deepest thing about him, and it is the thing that the title martyr points toward most honestly, even in its insufficiency. The service that is done in the absence of the things that make service feel meaningful, the recognition, and the community, and the institutional acknowledgement, and the sense of being part of something larger than yourself. All of these were absent on the roof. He served in their absence, day after day. Not performing service, but actually serving, the real thing rather than the version of it that is sustained by external validation. This is the hardest form of commitment available, not the commitment that is witnessed and celebrated and incorporated into a tradition that makes it legible. The commitment that happens alone, in the wind, because it is necessary and you are the one who understands the necessity, and therefore you are the one who provides it. He provided it. The man on the roof, the scholar who became the soldier, who became the thing the roof made of him. Harder than he started, stranger than he started, still the conviction, still the holding, still the daily recommitment to a conclusion that the evidence continued to support and that continued to require the presence that he continued to provide, until you arrived, and then you arrived, and the presence was no longer required in the form that it had taken, and what was held down by the weight of one man's centuries of staying still was released into the hands of the hunter who had climbed the steps to take it. And Logarius was whatever Logarius was in the moment of the releasing. What is a person in the moment that the thing they spent everything sustaining finally ends? Not a rhetorical question. An actual question about the specific quality of experience that the ending of a very long sustained commitment produces in the person who was sustaining it. The answer is probably not what the stories about sacrifice usually suggest. Not triumph, and not peace in the warm, complete sense of the word. Something more neutral than that. The specific neutrality of a condition that has simply changed. The weight was here and now the weight is not here. The absence of a weight that you have carried for long enough is not the same as lightness. It is just the absence of the weight. Strange in the specific way that the sudden removal of something you have adapted to always feels strange. He had adapted to the holding. His entire existence on the roof was an existence organized around the holding. The hardening and the strangening and the daily recommitment and the refinement of everything into its essential form. All of it had been in service of the holding. And now the holding was over. The person left after the holding is over is the person the holding produced. The harder, stranger, more essential version. Still the conviction. Still the rigorous, honest intelligence that had always been the organizing principle of what he was. But stripped of the specific ongoing demand that had organized the centuries, existing in the moment of the releasing without the thing the existing had been for. This is the ending. Not triumphant, not peaceful in the simple sense, the specific quiet of a very long thing that has finally concluded, in the form that the conclusion takes when the person who was sustaining the thing was also the thing, and the sustaining ends, past the holding, finally past it. Let the story settle now, not as a sequence of events to file away, as weight. The specific weight of centuries of sustained commitment finally reaching the moment the commitment was always pointed toward, even when the pointing was invisible from inside the commitment. The roof is empty. Whatever state the fight left it in, whatever the ending of Logarius produced in the specific physics of the game's world, the man is not on the roof anymore. The wind is still there. The frost is still there. The wrong sky is still above the castle. But the chair is empty and the crown is not on the head it was on for so long. The castle is still frozen below, still the stopped moment, still the chandeliers lit and the tables set and the world preserved at the exact point before the ending. This does not change when Logarius is no longer on the roof. The freezing is not his. It precedes him, and it continues after him. The castle held at the moment of its ending by something deeper than the containment that the crown provided. The castle will stay stopped. The chandeliers will stay lit. The tables will stay set. Annalise is still in the throne room, still the queen, still making the offer. The centuries did not diminish the offer, and the defeat of Logarius does not change what the offer is. She persists. She always persists. The specific property that made her the problem the mission could not fully solve makes her also the constant in every version of this story. She was there before the executioners came, and she is there after you leave, and she will be there in whatever the castle is after the night ends. Think about the crown. It is in your hands, or wherever the game keeps the things you carry. It is a Cainhurst object, made by the people who lived in the castle, worn by the man who ended what they were, worn by him for centuries to contain what the ending could not eliminate, and now in your hands, carrying in its weight the full length of everything that has passed through it. Objects accumulate history. This is one of the things that Bloodborne understands about objects that most game design does not fully express. The weight of an object is not only its physical weight, it is the weight of everything it has been used for and everything it has been held through, and everyone whose hands or head it has passed through. The crown weighs what it weighs, and it also weighs the castle and the battle and the throne room, and the decision in the throne room and the sentries on the roof, and the daily recommitment and the transformation and the fight and the ending. You are carrying all of that now. Every time you use the crown, every time you let it do what it does, reveal what it hides, open what it closes, you are using something that was built by one tradition and worn by its opposite and held through a duration that makes most human lifetimes look brief. He held it. For all of that. With the conviction intact and the cost fully paid and the transformation accepted because it was the price of the holding, and the holding was necessary. He held it. Rest now. The wind is still on the roof, and the chandeliers are still lit in the halls below, and the queen is still in the throne room, and the crown is in your hands. The stopped moment is still stopped. But somewhere in the accounting of what the night contains, in the specific column that tracks what has been held and what has finally been released, a very long entry has been closed. He held it. That is the record. That is the testament. That is all it needs to be, and it is enough. It is more than enough. Think about the castle now, not the roof, the whole castle. Walk back through it in your mind, from the entrance through the halls and the frozen rooms to the roof and back down again. The chandeliers still lit, the tables still set, the The stopped moment still stopped. The Queen in the throne room below the passage that is now open because the crown that concealed it is in your hands. This place will not unfreeze. There is no mechanism by which Cainhurst thaws. The frost is not the consequence of the crown being worn or the consequence of anything that ending the wearing changes. It is the consequence of what happened here, of what was done in the rooms that you walk through on the way to the roof, and what was done does not undo itself when the person who did it is gone. The castle will stay stopped. The chandeliers will stay lit. The tables will stay set. The stopped moment is the castle's permanent condition now. Logarius understood this. He understood that what he had done could not be undone, and that the castle's frozen state was the evidence of it, preserved not as an accusation but simply as the record of what was. He sat above it for centuries. He saw it every day. The stopped moment below him was part of what he held alongside the conviction, not as guilt but as weight, the full accounting of what the mission had required and what it had produced and what the producing had cost. He held it all, the conviction and the cost, the framework and its limits, the rightness and the full reckoning with what the rightness had required. He held it for as long as it needed to be held, and when something strong enough to end the holding arrived, the holding ended. The roof is empty, the crown is in your hands, the castle is still frozen, and the Queen is still in the throne room, and the wind is still on the roof, and everything that was true before the fight is still true after it except for one thing: the man is gone. Not simply gone in the sense of no longer present, gone in the specific sense that a person who was the last remaining piece of a tradition is gone when they go. The order is already dissolved. The hunters who trained with him are already gone. The conversations that made the tradition alive are already gone. He was the last person who held the full account, the conviction and the complication and the theological framework and its honest acknowledged limits, and the specific quality of attention he paid to the people he trained, and the specific weight of the people who did not come back from Cainhurst. That is gone now. The full account exists nowhere in any institutional record. The Church has the simplified version, the name and the title and the account of the mission's completion. The practitioners who carry the executioner tradition have the practices without the understanding that was supposed to be inseparable from the practices. The castle has the frozen evidence of what was done, and the Queen has the persistence that required the containment. Nobody has the full account, except the things it produced. The crown is in your hands, and the crown is the physical record of everything, not in the sense of containing a narrative or a document, in the sense that an object made by one tradition and used by another and sustained through centuries carries in its material existence the trace of everything it has been part of. The crown knows what it was and what it became and what it was used to hold. You are holding the record, the man who put the crown on in the empty throne room after the battle that the institution sent him to win, the man who understood what the situation required and was the only one who understood it, and therefore provided it himself without waiting for the institution to develop a response that he had assessed as insufficient. The man who held it for as long as the holding was necessary, and who was still holding it when you arrived, and who will not be holding it anymore. He is gone. The roof remembers him in the way that places remember the people who spent a long time in them, in the specific quality of the absence, which is shaped by what was present in a way that an absence that was always empty is not shaped. The roof knows that something was here, the frost knows, the wrong sky knows, and now you know. You have the crown and the story and the full weight of what the weight weighs. Take it with you into whatever the night still requires. It is more than enough. Good night, good hunter. Sleep well. Thank you for spending this time with Nightfall lore. If Logarius' story carried you somewhere tonight, leave a like and let me know in the comments what part stayed with you. The next story is already waiting. Until then, good night, good hunter.